I'm now going to continue my video series on Henry Ward Beecher and his sermons by asking you a question. Which is worse? If you don't know what the law says and you end up breaking the law, or if you do know what the law says and you still decide to break the law? Which is worse? Think about it for a second. Now, this was being brought up to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And why was it being brought up? Because Jesus himself knew that all three of these groups were secretly breaking God's law, even though they were making the following proclamations. They were proclaiming that they were better than the Gentiles. They were proclaiming that they had a personal relationship with God and that they had thoroughly memorized his laws. Think about that. Here were these people claiming that they had a personal relationship with God, they knew all of his laws, and they were better than the Gentiles, yet they were secretly breaking God's law. And Jesus was like, look, you think it's going to be bad for the Gentiles when they come before God's throne? Just wait till you guys come before God's throne. You think it's bad now? Wait. Now. All right. Now, the thing what Paul was saying was that if the Gentiles were obeying God's law, even though they didn't even know what God's law was, they would be in better shape facing the judgment of God than these Pharisees, these Sadducees, and these Essenes. Oops. Okay. Now, the first point we got to make is this. God's law existed long before he presented it to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. It's always been around. Okay? If you don't believe me, refer to the story of Cain and Abel. Okay? Thou shalt not kill was just as prevalent with the story of Cain and Abel as it was on Mount Sinai. So these laws have existed since the beginning of time. It was only on Mount Sinai that they were actually revealed to the Israelites. And then the Christians finally revealed it to all the Gentiles. Okay? Think about that. Now, how do people know what God's law is if they don't read it out of the Bible? Well, God places guilt in people before they are even born. Sure, people like us, we try to suppress that guilt, but it's still inside of us. That's a fact. Okay? And whether you take a Bible and you throw it in the trash, or even you go as far as to burn the dang thing, it won't change God's law at all. It may make it more difficult for you to communicate with God because you won't really comprehend how God works in the world, but it doesn't change the law, and it doesn't change your guilt about the law. Okay? You're guilty whether you've read the law or not. You're just a lot guiltier if you already know what the law says. That's all. You break it, that's it. Okay? Now then, Jesus himself declared that no one who has ever lived outside of himself has ever been able to keep the law successfully all the days of their life. But if it were possible to do that, obviously it's not, but if it were possible, then Gentiles, even though they had never read the law, if they managed to keep it all the days of their life, they would be able to go to heaven. Think about that. They would still be able to get into heaven because they were able to obey the law the entire days of their life, regardless of reading it or not. So it's not a matter of whether you've read it or not, it's whether you have kept it or not. And since nobody can keep it perfectly all the days of their life, that's why Jesus came to be our sacrifice for us. Jesus already knew we weren't going to be able to keep the law, so that's why he made the sacrifice. That way we have a chance of getting into heaven. Otherwise we'd have no chance whatsoever, whether we read the law or not, whether we understood it or not. Okay? And that's why we need Jesus. Okay? Now, God's law doesn't change just because mankind goes around and tries to deliberately misinterpret it. Okay? Remember this, just because you don't think you need to eat doesn't mean you don't need to eat. You do need to eat. You can think you don't need to eat all you want, but at a certain point you're going to eat. And the same thing with sleep. Just because you don't think you need to sleep doesn't mean you don't need to sleep. That's an inbuilt system. God built that inside of you. So don't think you don't need to sleep just because you don't feel like you want to sleep. Well, that's too bad. God says you're going to sleep, that's it. That's the rules. Doesn't matter what you think. Okay? Now, just because you don't like what the law says doesn't mean that you have now a license to disobey the law. Too bad. Just because you don't like the law of gravity doesn't mean you don't have to obey it. Just because you don't like the drunk driving laws doesn't mean you don't have to obey the drunk driving laws. That's just a fact. You still have to obey them even if you don't like them. You might not like the laws against bank robbery, but you still have to obey. Okay? Remember, it wasn't a church that created these laws. It wasn't Christians that created this law. It was God that created this law. So, see what I mean? And let me tell you something. It's not a matter of whether you break God's law. It's a matter of how bad God's law breaks you. Now, granted, there's no way, even Jesus himself declared that there is no way that you can keep the law perpetually, 24 hours a day, 365 days out of the year. Nobody has ever done it successfully, and nobody ever will except for Jesus. That's why he became our sacrifice. That's why we need him. Okay? Now, some people will stand there and say, well, gee, it's better that people go to a fake church than never go to church at all. Not so fast. Are we forgetting about Jim Jones? David Koresh? Really? It's better that they go to a real church than to go to a fake one. Okay? And there are ways of telling which churches are real and which churches are fake. Which shepherds are good leaders and which shepherds aren't. And I've illustrated some of those ways in previous videos. You don't want to follow the blind, because you'll end up stumbling just like them. Okay? After all, you don't want to be led astray. Now let me tell you something. God's law exists regardless of how many churches are in your community, how many Christians you have living next to you. Okay? If, heaven forbid, there never was a church again, if, heaven forbid, there wasn't another Christian on the face of the planet, and the only Christian left that was you, well, God's law would still be there. And the instructions are, you either obey the law perpetually for the rest of your natural life, or you rely on Jesus, the one who could. That's your two choices. You're either going to be able to obey the law from birth to death, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and Jesus himself said you couldn't do that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had to sacrifice himself. Or you have to rely on Jesus. And that was the deal with the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. They were claiming that they were able to keep that law 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And Jesus was like, you couldn't keep it 5 minutes. And then you're telling people that you're superior to the... Don't ever say you're superior to anybody when it comes to stuff like that. Don't ever say that, because Jesus will knock you down with those words. What he said to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes back then is still true today. You are not superior to anybody else when it comes to sin. You're just as bad at it as they are, or were. The only salvation from that is Jesus, because Jesus was the only living creature that was able to successfully obey the law 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that's what Paul was talking about in the book of Romans. Okay? He was saying, literally, don't stand there and say you're superior to the Gentiles, and don't stand there and tell me you can keep the law perpetually, because we already know you can't do that. Jesus said so, so there you go. You're already screwed. See what I mean? All right. I hope you found that to be very informative. I will tell you more in a future video, so I want you to stay tuned.